Hello and welcome to another story with Boo. This week's story comes from Scotland. Now, quite a few years ago, actually before I had Boo, I'd gone for a walk down to Baggy Point. It was a beautiful, beautiful day, and I had sat down on a bench to enjoy the view, to look out over the sea and look towards Lundy Island. And I happened to be sharing the bench with an old lady. She was older than I'd ever seen somebody before, but her eyes were bright and she had this beautiful, soft Scottish accent that rose and fell like the ebb and flow of the waves. And so I got lulled into having a long conversation with her because her voice was so hypnotic. And we were talking about Lundy Island, and I was telling her about the puffins and the seals that lived there. And she said to me, did I know about the sea people, about the Selkies that lived up in Scotland? I said, no, I'd never heard of them before. She said, yes, they were seals that were able to shed their skins and take on human form. I was like, no, I've never heard of Selkies before. And she said to me, but now you shall. And so she began. It was a beautiful oyster and pearl afternoon, and a weary fisherman had come back from a night and a day from fishing, and he peeled off his salt-stiff clothes and fell instantly asleep in his chair. After a couple of hours, by which time the moon had risen, he decided to go for a walk along the beach. And just as he was starting out along the beach, he noticed in the distance a group of seal people singing and dancing in the moonlight, singing and dancing in the shallows of the waves. And he stood and he stared and he was completely mesmerised. They were so beautiful and their voices just sounded like they came from another world. But of course, as soon as the sea people realised that the fisherman was watching them, they stopped straight away and ran as quickly as they could and ran towards their pile of seal skins that until that moment had just looked like a wet, slippery rock. And the fisherman, he started running too. Now most of them got to their seal skins, grabbed them, slipped them on, turned back into their seals and plunged into the waves and were gone. But there was one woman who was so caught up in the singing and the dancing, she was a few breaths behind her brothers and sisters. And so it was that the fisherman got to her seal skin before she did. And he tucked it under his arms and stood and looked at her. Please, she said, please, I need my skin. If I don't have my skin, I can't turn back into a seal. And if I don't have my skin, I can't go back into the sea. Well, he said, I've caught myself some fancy catches in my time, but never quite like this. And he had already decided that he was going to keep her, that he certainly was not going to let her have the seal skin that was tucked under his arm. Please, she said, please let me have back my seal skin. But the fisherman would hear none of it. He had spent so many years on his own, he decided that he would quite like to have a wife. And so taking the seal woman by the hand, he led her back to his little house. And when he got there, he locked her in and he immediately went and took her seal skin and he hid it into in the barn. There was all these hay bales. and he moved a hay bale and put her skin at the back and put the hay bale back in place. And when he went back to the house, the seal woman was still there because, well, without her skin, she had nowhere to go. And the years passed, and they did indeed get married. And they had children. They had 3 children, in fact, because without her seal skin, she had nowhere to go. And the fisherman, for his part, he didn't mean to be unkind to her. He was loving and gentle and generous. But the one thing he would never give her, he would never give her back her seal skin. And the seal woman was a good mother to her 3 children, and she loved them dearly. But most days she would go down to the beach and would sit on a rock. And as she sat there, a huge seal would lift his head up out of the waves and call and bark to her in the language of the sea, and she would call back to him in the language that they shared. But eventually she would have to turn her back and return to her little cottage, to her fisherman husband and her 3 children. Now one day, the children, being children, went exploring, and they went into the barn, and even though they had been told many, many times not to climb on the hay bales, that's exactly what they were doing. Now one of the children gave the other child a push. They scrabbled and grabbed hold of a bale, and as they did so, the bale fell to the floor, and there was the seal skin. The children took it. Oh, it was so soft. They smelt it, smelt of the sea, and they took it back to their mother, curious about what this strange thing was that they had found. And their mother took it in her hands and held it very gently. And she looked at her 3 children, and she looked back at the skin in her hands. And then she fiercely hugged each of her child in turn and showered them with kisses and told them that she loved them and told them that she would always love them. And with that, she span on her heel and she ran out the door. The children were frightened and immediately ran after their mother, and they saw her slip on her skin, give a loud whoop of joy as this huge, beautiful seal did an arcing dive and dove into the waves. And another seal joined her, and together these 2 seals jumped and leaped and played in the waves. The children stood there and looked at her, and she lifted up her head, her seal head, and then gently slipped beneath the waves. When the fisherman came home, he found the children waiting on the beach, and he immediately knew what must have happened. And he called out, "Wife, wife, come back to me." And the seal woman lifted up her head out of the waves. "Husband," she said, "you were kind to me, and you loved me, and in my way I loved you too. Look after our children. Look after them very well forever. But as much as I loved you, I have always loved my first seal husband more." And with that, her head slipped beneath the waves and she was gone. The old woman paused in her story. "But what about the children?" I asked. "What about those poor children with their no mother anymore?" Well, she said, every birthday the children would wake in the morning and would find something on their pillow next to them. And they would find wet footprints on their bedroom floor. But how do you know this? I said. How do you know this to be true? And she said, because the old fisherman was my great-grandfather, and one of the children was my grandfather, she said. I laughed and looked at her and went, no, you're having a joke with me, you're teasing me. And she just looked at me and held up her hand and opened her fingers. And in between her fingers was a thin, transparent web. She just closed her hand and smiled and got up and carried on with her walk. And that is the end of that story.